Welcome, everybody, to the Compassion Choices California Campaign Speaker Training. My name is Crystal Smith. I am the director of our storytelling project, which is something I'm very proud of, something that shows the importance that our storytellers have to this campaign. That we would devote an entire position to working with you says a lot. What we're going to be talking about today is just an overview of some of the things that you as a speaker would need to know, including the latest news about the campaign, some of the key messages that our research team have developed to make our points come across as clearly as possible, what to say and what not to say, which is very important as well, as we'll see. A little bit about public speaking and a little bit about being interviewed by the media. So let's start with the basics. The California campaign. So Compassionate Choices has launched this Aid in Dying campaign here in our home state of California. Our goal is to make aid in dying available to all Californians as an end-of-life choice. We know that a majority of Californians support this, which is specifically the ability of a mentally competent, terminally ill adult to choose a peaceful death. Although few Californians may use it, countless people will benefit from the peace of mind that it brings. And I just want to point out that in this instance, whenever we say terminally ill, we mean someone with a prognosis of 6 months or less to live. CNC has been working with the lead authors of this legislation, Senators Wolk and Monning, and the bill is called SB 128, the End of Life Option Act. So please note that it's option singular because we are talking about one option of the many that are available to Californians. We're focusing on this one. And also SB 128 is modeled very closely on the Oregon Death with Dignity law that was passed 17 years ago. And we have a lot of data from those nearly 2 decades that this has been the law in Oregon to support the fact that there have been no abuses and that the safeguards work. So the bill was introduced in January, and we know that Californians overwhelmingly support this law. The latest polling, we see that 64% of Californians support aid in dying, 74% of U.S. adults believe that terminally ill patients who are in pain should have the right to end their lives. And perhaps most exciting is that 54% of doctors in the U.S. would support the decision of a patient who wanted to end his or her own life. And this is the first time that we have the majority of doctors agreeing. So some of our key talking points we can always fall back on when we're giving interviews or talking to crowds or individuals, doesn't matter. There's a few things that we're going to go over that I recommend you always have as a fallback. It works as an answer to just about any question, and we'll go over that in a little bit, how to sort of turn things around to get your points across. But the key points here are: it is completely unacceptable that someone like Brittany Bernard would have to leave her home state, her family, her community, her job, her medical team in order to die peacefully. Americans are free to choose how they live, and when the time comes, how they die. This is a private and personal decision and should be free from government interference. Medical aid in dying is needed because we know that too many people suffer needlessly at the end of life. And many of our storytellers have anecdotes from their own lives to support this. Too many endure unrelenting pain at their end of life, and too many turn to violent means at the end of their lives when medical aid could have helped them to die peacefully. So one thing I want to mention about your audience, whether it's an audience of one or many, we know that in general, A third of the audience are going to be already with you, and a third are going to be dead set against what we're talking about, and you'll probably never reach them. Certainly not through facts and figures, and certainly not through arguments. As much as we believe in the righteousness of our cause, it is not a good exercise to engage the other side in their arguments. Instead, we always focus on the undecided 30%. So it really helps to think about your audience as undecided, perhaps needing some more information, certainly needing to hear about your experience in order to make up their minds about medical aid in dying. So a lot of the words that our opponents use are very problematic, and we should be able to go over that and make sure that we don't use those words. And what words should we use? Psychological research suggests that people are more likely to use facts to justify their beliefs than they are to use facts to decide what to believe. So, we will not win this campaign by focusing on facts. Facts don't win campaigns. Values must be front and center. Only if we speak to people's values will we win the campaign. So we know that we need to frame any discussion on this issue to resonate with people's values. We're speaking to their hearts. We want to reach supporters who might be on the fence about aid in dying, and to do that, we must understand the language and messages that resonate with them most strongly. Your favorite argument in support of this may not resonate with someone else. Instead, sometimes the most important thing you can do is listen. This will help you to understand the other person's perspective so you can meet them where they live. So, one of the key terms, you've probably noticed that I'm not using death with dignity, although that is the name of the law in Oregon, and we certainly refer to it as a death with dignity law. It is far preferable to use medical aid in dying, end of life option, end of life medical option, or shortening the dying process. And the main reason for this is our opponents accuse us of saying that this is the only way to die with dignity and that any other way is undignified. That is certainly not our message. It's not what we're trying to say. But if we say death with dignity, it does carry that implication, and that's why we're trying to get away from that. We do know some things that really work well in reaching people's hearts and values. And one of those things is your own personal journey towards supporting death with dignity. How did you come to these terms? Was it the loss of a loved one? Was it your own terminal illness? These journey stories are very, very helpful in reaching those undecided folks who may not have a personal experience but want to hear about yours. What they also like to hear about is the role of your family members and their support. It doesn't always happen right away. In the case of Brittany Menard, for instance, we know that it was very difficult for her mother to accept that this is what she wanted. And people responded to that aspect of her story because they could see themselves in that. So it wasn't a negative. We don't need to say, Brittany's family was completely on board 100%. It's okay to say, it took them a while to see why this was the right thing for her. The other message we want to make sure is always clear is that a person is not suicidal who wants to access aid in dying. This person already has a death sentence. They have a disease, they have a diagnosis. That's what's going to be on their death certificate. For instance, in Oregon, when somebody uses medical aid in dying, their death certificate shows the underlying disease as the cause, and that is the fact. These people want to live, they love life. Also, spiritual and religious beliefs, especially if you're Catholic or Christian, it's wonderful to model how you came to think about this separately from what the church dictates. And people also like to hear details of treatment. And again, in the example of Brittany's case, we were able to show all of the treatments, the therapies, the trials that she attempted to avail herself of so that the point is that every option is being explored, and nothing is ignored. Also, you probably noticed that our opponents love to call this assisted suicide or physician assisted suicide, and that is incredibly problematic because suicide is the act of a depressed, desperate person who's often uses violent means to end their life, often in isolation from their family and without their knowledge or obviously consent. This is very different than what we are talking about. Other terms that are problematic is euthanasia. Why? Because a third party is in control, not the patient. Physician assisted suicide. The physician does not assist. The physician writes a prescription, and that is the beginning and end of their involvement. Often they are not present. There's a misconception that this is a shot that is administered. A little bit like the death penalty, and that's certainly not the case. And of course, mercy killing, again, a third party is in control. It's not the patient. And this movement is about giving a patient control at the end of life. Death with dignity simply means that people who are already dying have options to help them have good deaths. Medical aid in dying is not something that people with dementia or Alzheimer's can avail themselves of because of the mental competency requirement. People in a coma, oftentimes people with ALS and muscular problems, are not able to self-administer, and anyone under the age of 18. These are all people for whom we are not talking about them when we're talking about SB 128, end of life option. It's, as I said, it's not something that a doctor administers or makes the decision to administer. It's also not something that the patient has to use. In fact, in Oregon, we know that less than half the patients who asked for the prescription actually use it. Some of them fill it and have it, and it gives them great peace of mind, but they don't actually use it. Some people just know they have the prescription, and that is enough. So that's very important to keep in mind. Also, let's clarify, when we talk about self-administering, we're talking about approximately 100 pills that are prescribed. They are ground up and mixed with a drink, juice, most often, although alcohol has been used. And that is something that the person must be able to drink themselves. One of the things, as I mentioned, euthanasia is not a good analogy, and that is a lot of times people compare this to, they say we treat our animals better than we treat our humans. How come animals are able to be put to sleep? Well, that doesn't compare because that is not the patient, or in this case the pet, being in control. This is a third party making that decision. So that is not an apt analogy, and it's not one that we encourage. Also, we never talk about this in terms of making the patient less of a burden on their family members. For obvious reasons, that is not a reason to choose medical aid in dying, and it's one of the things that our opponents accuse us of having sort of an agenda, especially the disability community, saying that, oh, you just want to get rid of sick people. And this is, of course, not borne out by the evidence. In fact, the safeguards that we'll talk about in a little bit are designed specifically to weed out somebody who is either being coerced or is depressed and wants to use this as a way out. So these arguments are not valid. Getting back to your story for a moment, I just know that Brittany's a perfect example. Somebody will be able to relate to you on a level that makes them think about this issue like they never did before. Who you are and how you got involved, why this matters to you, and what your own wishes are surrounding your own death are incredibly powerful tools in our kit to reaching out to people. Also, we know that stories speak to hearts and shared values. They ground policy in real life. It's easier for people to grasp concepts and retain information about something as complex as this new law when it's tied into a real person's experience. It depoliticizes the issue, it opens doors. And again, I'll say this many times in this presentation, people don't remember facts and figures, but they do remember stories and anecdotes. In terms of public speaking, some of the things I want to share with you, you probably know most of these instinctively. People remember best what they heard last, so be sure to have a strong close. Never argue or throw around facts. Concentrate on shared values. We don't want to engage people in their arguments. We don't have to in order to make our point. Show, don't tell why this movement matters for everybody. Practice, practice, practice. The more comfortable you are telling your story, the more impact it will have. And that is, I am a resource here for you to do that. I can help you with your story. I know a lot of things that work and don't, and please be sure to use me for that. Also, please stay on the lookout for other people's stories. Stories beget stories. Some of my best storytellers, I found them because they had responded to a story, written a comment to a story online, and said, well, this is what actually happened to me. And so a lot of times people don't even realize they have a story or think that their story is powerful as a tool to reach other people. But it's very important that as storytellers, you will certainly encounter people who have their own stories to share, and that's incredibly important. Please refer them to me. I'll have my contact information at the end of this presentation. And as you know, at the very least, we like to collect these stories for an archive that we will be sharing with legislators and policymakers to show the many different needs and demands for this law. Some Compassion and Choices spokespeople who've gone out and done this before you, I asked them for some advice, and here's just a little bit of what they had to say. It takes 7 seconds to make a first impression. 38% is how you look, and 55% is your behavior. Definitely know your audience, who you're talking to, where they are. Are they undecided, for instance? And enjoy your audience, because if you want to be there, that will come across. And one of the best tips I ever got was the idea of speaking with a smile. Obviously, this is not something to be giddy about, but you want to be approachable. And oftentimes, when we're talking about tough issues like death and dying, it's easy to find yourself being sort of pedantic, and you don't want to do that. Most important is to be honest and be yourself. Always stand, never give a talk from a seated position, and never read. You don't want to just read a speech to somebody. Always speak slowly. There you have it. Speak with a smile. Be brief and focused. Always leave room for silence. That is fine. Even if no one else fills it, it allows what you're saying to sink in. And again, we're talking about some really tough issues that a lot of people have not considered, certainly in terms of their own mortality, their own death, or family members. So this may be the first time that they're sort of going there. No more than one stat that you can use, but really know it cold. So I always suggest that 2/3 of Californians support medical aid in dying is a perfect fact to work into pretty much anything that you're talking about. Be sure to be clear about what your ask is, what is your intention, and if you need to use notes or flashcards, that's fine. Don't wing it. All right. Next slide. How to handle hostile questions. So first and foremost, you don't have to answer questions that make you uncomfortable. We don't want to put you in that position, and you don't need to be in that position. A lot of times, the hostility comes from a person who is struggling with the issue or trying to come to terms with it. So assume good intent. Be diplomatic, ask for clarification. Oftentimes, when the person has to repeat the question or clarify the question, it removes some of the hostility. People tend to soften as they elaborate. Another thing you can do is paraphrase the question to take out the inflammatory terms and ensure that you understand what it is they're trying to get at. And certainly validate the speaker's concern, the questioner's concern. Hostile questions come from frustrated people. So dismissing a concern is a terrible idea. But on the contrary, I've found that when I'm talking to folks and they say, well, wait a minute, what about, such and such, or I don't get it. I always thought da da da. Oftentimes, I went through the same process myself. And so I share that with them. I said, yeah, that's exactly what I thought going into this. I did not realize, what I know now. So it's a great way, once again, to meet people on their own turf. If the media calls you directly, and again, part of our storytelling project is designed so that we are the intermediary. We will put you in touch with media if we think that it's a good fit, or people are asking for speakers at an event, or to go on legislative visits, or perhaps to write an op ed. But we know anecdotally this happens all the time. Somebody is interviewed and then they're just contacted directly by another reporter. So, first things is to notify Patricia Portillo. She's our communications director, and that's her direct line there. So, if nothing else, you can refer them directly to her. If you do sort of have a conversation with the reporter and you find out what they're looking for, it's always good to know what is their deadline. Is this a one-on-one interview, or are you being put into a panel or a debate? Is it live? That makes a huge difference, especially with broadcast. You're able to be more yourself and go back and re-answer some of your questions if it's not live. It's also very helpful to see the questions in advance, and it's a perfectly legitimate thing to ask for. So those are the things that you want to keep in mind. When you are getting prepared for the interview, you want to sort of have a cheat sheet of the most important messages that you want to get across. So I have a little template for you, and basically, one of those is going to be a point about your own story, your own aha moment of coming to terms with why you believe this law is necessary. And one of them is going to be the fact that 2/3 of Californians already support the idea of this law, because that's always a good one to go to. And I think the other one that I like to use is this fact: every family is one bad death away from understanding why we need this law. And the beauty of having these in your head and on your cheat sheet is that if only one of these gets in the story, then you've definitely succeeded in getting a major point across. Remember that anything you say, especially in the pre-interview, can be used and will be used. So be careful with that. Reporters can be incredibly friendly and engaging and get you talking and be fascinated by what you have to say, but you want to remember that, sort of less is more. And anything you say, whether it's on the record or in conversation, can definitely be used. And finally, be flexible. Deadlines change constantly, and some of our spokespeople have gotten really frustrated. It's exciting. You get a call to be on MSNBC, and it's in 2 hours. Oh, but then they change it. Actually, it's not going to be till tomorrow. And then tomorrow there's another breaking story, so it becomes next week. So we know that this happens, and it can be very frustrating, but it's not personal. It's definitely the nature of the business. So, one of the greatest things about being a storyteller is that you are already the expert on your story, and there's nothing more that you need to have expertise on, and there's no one who has the expertise that you do about your own personal experience. Don't hesitate to ask the reporter to start over. That's especially true if it's not live. Um, Do not volunteer information. As I said earlier, the longer your answer, the more you provide to be sensationalized or taken out of context. I talked earlier about using silence in your public speaking, but oftentimes reporters and interviewers will use silence intentionally. You've answered the question, and then they just kind of look at you because they want you to fill that void. The things that you say to fill the void are often less thought out, and those can be kind of juicy. So we always say, if someone's just staring at you, stare back, wait it out, give them a smile. Don't play that game. And certainly don't answer any question that puts you in the position of a spokesperson for compassionate choices. And the tendency is often, for instance, if you're asked to speak in front of a school group, the questions are certainly going to be beyond what your story is. They're going to say, why hasn't this law passed in California before? You don't want to speculate. You don't even want to give the right answer if you know it. You are not a spokesperson for compassionate choices. You are here to talk about the why of the campaign, not the what. So in general, for instance, in that example of speaking with a school group, we'll always have somebody from CNC there with you who can jump in and answer those kinds of questions. So as tempting as it is, and as much of an expert as you are on the issue overall, it's very important not to get put into that role. So I mentioned this earlier about sort of pivoting. You can always turn around a question and work in one of those 3 points that you have on your cheat sheet. Again, I'm here to tell my story, the why of the campaign and not the what. I'm not an expert, and so I really can't answer that. I'm sorry, or I'd like to know the answer to that as well. That's fine. And always feel free to clarify. A couple times I've given interviews, and at one point I'll say something and I'll say, you know what, I just want to make sure that if you use that soundbite, you know that this is my personal opinion. I'm not speaking on behalf of Compassionate Choices when I say this. I've had a couple of questions about a recent lawsuit that was filed by a leukemia patient and doctors, and people often assume that this was a CNC lawsuit, and that's actually not the case. This is the Disability Rights Legal Center. Officially what we say is that we're very pleased that the Disability Rights Center is playing a role. We certainly welcome the disability community to the movement. They're a very important voice. Does not conflict with any of our efforts to pass SB 128. In fact, even with a court win, our legislation would be necessary to provide those safeguards that are part of the law in Oregon. And the urgency is there. Dying Californians need this law now, and having this lawsuit really sort of underscores that. So we see it as a positive. So a little bit more about messaging. Memorable lines. For example, every family is one bad death away from understanding why we need this. That's getting used a lot. Touch hearts with emotionally positive language. So again, I'm talking about talking with a smile, making yourself approachable. This is another statistic about impact. They say 40% of your impact is from your nonverbal, and 40% is from your voice, and only 20% is the actual content of what you say. So now we get into some of the specifics that our messaging research team have developed based on focus groups that they've done with various ethnic groups, gender groups, age groups, to really understand what people do and don't respond to when we talk about death. So one of the things that's quite fascinating actually is to remember that death happens within families and networks, not just to the person who is ill. As I talked about earlier, it can be messy. Not everybody's on board at the same time, but it's important and to model this. Showing a journey from conflict to support is very important. It's very relatable. Things are not always black and white. Take aid in dying out of a medicalized context. Make it about people and families. Don't use clinical and technical jargon. Very simple example. One of the things that is so basic that we've incorporated into all of our messaging is that we never talk about a patient, we talk about a person. Everyone can relate to a person. Not everybody can relate to a patient, nor do they want to. We like to use communications that mirror people's emotional conflict and model how they resolve those conflicts to support this loss. So, for example, in Brittany's story, the way that it was initially presented was, the family is completely behind her. Um, but in reality, there was a whole journey to acceptance that her mother, has since discussed and talked about how difficult it was for her. So instead, it's better to, for instance, Brittany could have said, when I first raised the issue of medical aid in dying, it was difficult for my family to be supported. None of us wanted to lose hope. That's the honest answer. Um, we also, I mentioned this earlier, very important to show that the person who is making or would make this decision loves life, has a desire to live. You're not giving up. You're still trying everything, and you want to enjoy the time that you have left. But if you have a terminal cancer diagnosis, you know that that's what is going to kill you. You're being realistic. And be clear about how a person and their family can exercise this option. So, whereas in the past we sort of talk about self administering, well, what does that look like? We can talk about it. It's a prescription of about 100 pills that are crushed and added to juice that our loved one had to drink in one step. Avoid messaging that's critical or dismissive of religion or specific faith, especially regarding death. It's always better if you have a Christian or Catholic background, if you can communicate in that voice. One of the main objections that community has to what our message is that they argue that we're not leaving room for miracles, and miracles happen, and hope happens. So oftentimes, a conflicted audience thinks that aid in dying is a complete rejection of the power of God and miracles. So we have to reframe it to show that miracles can actually be present in the context of aid in dying. So, for example, we had a storyteller say, God helped me to see that the true miracle was in the precious time that we spent together as a family in Mom's final days. And the peace of mind that she had with the aid in dying option was the actual miracle. And again, no judgment. We don't want to put anybody else down, anybody's other opinions down, if they wouldn't make the same decision, because ultimately, what are we talking about? We're talking about an option. You don't have to use it. I may not want to use it, but I'm certainly not going to tell you what your position should be, and I would appreciate it if you would not limit my option. So one of our storytellers put this beautifully. He said, I don't have to walk in her shoes. As her son, I simply have to respect and honor her dying wishes. She wants the option to die with dignity, and it's not for us to decide or deny her that option. So that sums up a lot of the things that we're talking about. The role of the family, the journey of the family, the desire of the individual, and how it is all about, ultimately, all about the person, the individual who is terminally ill. Some things that we want to avoid. The word control is actually problematic for a lot of people. Saying that you can control the end of life is not something that resonates with a lot of our audiences. So instead, we describe it as such. Terminally ill people in the final stages of their disease can request aid in dying to maintain some comfort in their final days, to ease their pain and suffering, and help them pass peacefully. We also don't want to suggest that there's only one way to die a dignified death. I know we've talked about this before, but it bears repeating. One of our advocates, Christy O'Donnell, said, there are many ways to die with dignity, and I truly respect those who would make a different decision. This legislation would provide an option in the range of end-of-life care decisions available to those in the final stages of a terminal illness. These could also include additional treatment, pain management, comfort care, and hospice. These are all options that we 100% support. Another problem is anything that indicates this is an issue that only affects affluent, liberal, secular white people. Um, for instance, within Britney's story, it was problematic for some people to hear about all of her travels and the fact that her entire family was able to move to Oregon with her because it made her less relatable. So we always want to keep that in mind. And once again, don't ever speak of this as a way for someone to be less of a burden on their families. That is not a good reason to support this law. So I want to thank you very much for taking the time to listen to all of these points. You have my email address here. I am here for you, whether it's helping to set up meetings, helping to write an op-ed. We will be keeping you in the loop whenever we have events coming up or specific asks. When the media calls in your region, I want to be able to call on you as a storyteller. Reporters love to have stories to go with their coverage of this law. So that's going to be a great way for you to participate. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen, and I look forward to working together.